Welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. I'm the host, Nathan Battishall, and as per what I usually do, once a month, I like to jump onto the podcast and share some thoughts and insights. And I want to share some thoughts today in this episode around a strategy that I found has worked very well in 2024, but I think it's going to be a really good strategy to operate in for 2025, especially with some of the tricky elements around the economy, inflation, and even just that build space. I'm finding some developments, it's tricky to make good returns. This strategy, it's not a new strategy. It's been around for a long time, but I think it often gets overlooked and neglected. And I think it's important to understand when you are coming up with a development strategy, you've got to look at your market. Who are the vendors? Who are the people that we can target properties off at the moment to use with development potential to do projects, profitable projects that can generate wealth, that can enable you to get a healthy return on your investment. And also, you've got to look at who the end buyer is. Who are you developing this product for? We're seeing at the moment that there's a lot of product being developed that's having difficulty selling, and possibly it could be because that product has been developed for a buyer that currently doesn't exist, or for a buyer that currently is not able to get into the market or to purchase. And that's why it's so vital and important to get a really good, strong understanding of who your buyer is, who the end buyer is. So I want to talk today about developing the big backyards. All across New South Wales, all across Australia, we see these huge, big backyards. They're all up and down suburban areas, regional areas, on the coast, all up and down New South Wales. We see this big house built on a nice big quarter-acre block, half-acre block, sometimes even bigger, where that was the great Australian dream. And we see there's a buying pool. We're seeing that in the next 10 years, we have a record number of baby boomers that are coming into retirement. We've got a record number of that generation, my parents' generation, who are coming to the end of their work life, who worked really hard and maybe bought that property in the 60s, 70s, 80s or 90s. There's a big generation that bought these properties quite a while ago, and they bought them very cheap. They've paid off their mortgage. But the thing is, a lot of this generation, they've got this massive backyard, and what's going to happen, especially over this next decade, we're going to have more and more of this demographic wanting to downsize or wanting to downsize their backyard. Some people want to stay living in the house. They might be well able to continue to live in that big house, but they've got this enormous backyard that was great when the kids were growing up. They could kick a ball around, play backyard cricket. They could have a veggie garden. They could have all those sort of things. But as life changes, as age comes upon you, that big backyard, all of a sudden, that full day Saturday or Sunday, maintaining that big backyard and looking after it, manicuring the gardens, the lawns, cleaning the big pool that no one swims in anymore, it can start to wear thin. And we've got a record number of these properties littered all over our state. And I think that's one of the best areas to target is those properties that have been bought in the 70s, 80s, 90s. People have gained incredible capital growth over those properties, but within those backyards holds an opportunity to develop that space and to develop those spaces to create incredible multi-dwelling or dual occupancy type opportunities. Now, first and foremost, we have a hungry vendor in that space who are keen to downsize. So first and foremost, there's a record number of vendors, I believe, in this next decade who will want to downsize or who are open at least to the conversation around either them developing their own backyard or doing a joint venture, and that's something we can chat about, or them potentially selling their site and then buying something that's a little easier on the maintenance. They don't have to manicure and maintain such a big backyard. And look, for me, I just think it's a terrific strategy because in this current market, often, and I get to see feasibilities, I get to look at numbers, I get to help people crunch numbers. I'm seeing feasibilities day in, day out, dozens of them. And at the moment, I'm finding a lot of sites, people are looking at sites and they're looking at sites on the market, even off market, and a lot of sites aren't stacking up to do a knockdown and build a duplex or to do a knockdown and build 3 townhouses. Often we're finding that in this current climate of 2024 and as we jump into 2025, we're seeing that this type of development strategy in some areas is just not stacking up. And often I find, and I know I harp on about this, and I think it's just such an incredible strategy, is try and keep stock. Try and keep a property where you can. Because if you're not having to knock it down, straight away there's your demolition cost saved. Then you're not having to rebuild it again, only to sell it or to hold it if you're going to rent it out. So the key is to look for properties, and there's so many of these around where you've got like a really nice size, could be a 3-bedder, 4-bedroom house, often single-storey, at the front of the property. And what was common on a lot of these properties, they had a driveway access, or they had a fairly large access, and there's a lot of these houses where they almost had the ability to fit a car down either side of the house. And these type of sites are brilliant because a lot of these houses didn't have garages and still don't. Some people have built carports and that sort of thing, but there's still a lot of sites that don't have garages. So you've got this big house in the middle of the block, huge backyard. You've got sometimes 3 to 4 metres on the right, 3 to 4 metres on the left. So what that does, that gives an opportunity to look at, okay, what could be done on this site? Could this site be developed with future additional yield? And often you'll find that you've got enough access to create a driveway that can go down to the back of the property, and depending on the lot size of the property, depending on that zoning of that property, every council's different. Some councils allow multi-dwelling in R2 zoning. Places like Newcastle, places like Shell Harbour, Wollongong councils. There's some councils that allow multi-dwelling development on R2 provided it meets the minimum width of a block. And a minimum lot size. Some councils require 600, 800, 900. Some let you get away with a 15-metre frontage width, some even less. And there's some that require like 18 metres. Wollongong, for example, you need 18 metres to do a multi-dwelling. And if it meets those requirements, you can potentially develop the backyard while keeping that house. You've got to make sure you've got enough width to create a driveway that can go down to the back. And a lot of people sometimes look at, okay, I've got 3 metres or 2.9 metres. Now, some councils won't allow a 2.9 metre width. Some councils might want a 3 metre driveway but also a landscape strip. Or sometimes you might be able to get away with a variation. Every council's different. Depends on the type of titling, whether you want a strata or torrents. Sometimes you can't torrents title properties if they're in the rear. A lot of councils are trying to negate that now, the ability to do that type of titling. So you've got to look at that as well. But there are some exciting and incredible factors of what you can do in a backyard, within a big backyard. Remember, that was the great Australian dream decades ago. Now the great Australian dream for a lot of young couples is just to own a property. No matter what it is, whether it be a unit, a duplex, a townhouse, or for some lucky ones, a house. But essentially what the great Australian dream was for a lot of people decades ago, now I think is the great Australian dream for investors and developers to look at these big blocks as opportunities to do projects and to do developments. And I find a lot of these deals in this current climate that we're in, remember, we've always got to pivot. When we're in these type of climates, we've got to look at ways we can pivot, ways that we can actually decide, you know what, I might have my strategy of developing, but your strategy of developing might have worked post-COVID when it was booming, but that strategy may not work in our 24, 25 climate, possibly 26. So you've got to constantly look at ways to pivot, and you've got to be creative. You know, one thing I think that investors and developers, people like yourself who are wanting to do projects, sometimes forget that you have to develop a creative mind. You've got to develop the ability to think differently, to look at things differently, to possibly get out of your sometimes we just get very laser focused on our strategy, which is important. Don't get me wrong. It's important to know your strategy, hone in on your strategy and develop it and strengthen it. But the problem is that can become a downfall for some people because they become so laser focused on their strategy that they develop blind spots in the market, blind spots with the economy, blind spots with the possibilities even. And sometimes people will only look at a site through one lens, and that's why I've got a little tool, and whether it be a hack, and it's nothing new under the sun, but it's just something that I have developed. When I look at a site, I like to look at a site and say, how many strategies can I come up with? I almost test myself. How many scenarios can I create on this site? It might take me half a day, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Normally I can do it in 5-10 minutes these days, but I'll look at every single scenario that I can possibly think of on that block. Sometimes I can come up with 20 scenarios on one development site. Now, of those 20, 15 or 16 of them, you might just cross out straight away, but the exercise of actually thinking creatively, thinking strategically, and actually not leaving a stone unturned, there's something to be said about having that type of attitude and that type of mindset, because what it is, it's taking the blinkers off. It's taking your complacency hat off and deciding that, you know what, I want to look at every single avenue and every single opportunity and possibility of what I can actually achieve on this site. I want to look at different development possibilities. I want to look at villas. I want to look at dual locks. I want to look at duplexes. I want to look at townhouses. I might want to look at manor houses, boarding houses, co-living. I might want to look at just keeping the house and doing a 2-lot subdivision or a 1-lot subdivision, maybe selling off the land and then keep holding the house as a long term. I might want to look at a combination of sell and hold. I might want to look at a combination of sell it all. I might want to look at a combination of selling a couple and maybe having something unencumbered. I want to look at a combination of selling it all and then what that's going to do for the next project. There's so many scenarios, not just development types, but then scenarios of a rent versus a hold versus a combination of both. There's so many different avenues, and then you can look at possibilities of the demographic, the buyer. Who is the ultimate buyer? Where is the market leading? What is the biggest buying pool at the moment? There's so many things that you've got to look at, especially in a market like this. See, a lot of people get scared in a market like this. I hear two sides of the coin. Some of my most switched on clients, they love this market because it's a lot of people shut up shop. A lot of people shut up shop and they sit and they wait and they hold and they do nothing. And I get it. A lot of people they listen to the media, they get fearful of things. And look, let's be honest, there's a lot of scenarios that do not stack up in this market. But the people I've found who continue to thrive and do well in this market are the people who think outside the box, the people who think creatively, have a strategy, develop a strategy, aren't afraid to pivot, aren't afraid to actually change and actually morph or pivot their usual strategy into something that is more climate specific, that is something more towards the now environment, something that is very much geared towards really getting a good gauge and a study on who is the biggest buying pool at the moment, who is the most cashed up. Am I looking to hold? What areas can I target? What areas can I look at? What is my opportunity in this time? Or some people wanting to land bank or secure sites or see this as an opportunity where the power is in the hands of the buyer at the moment in finding sites and, settling and getting really good terms, really good settlements and really just maybe lowering deposits, lowering holding costs and coming up with strategies, JVing, possibly partnering up with a builder if you're not the builder developer, and just looking for ways to actually do things smart in this current climate. And I've just found that there's huge amounts of space for that. So for me, this is a really exciting strategy that I think that has massive legs, because we've got a motivated vendor in this space. More and more of this vendor is going to downsize. More and more of this vendor, they're empty nesters. A lot of them have been for some 10, 15, even 20 years now. And a lot of this vendor is getting to the point where they're starting to think about downsizing. They're starting to think about opportunities. And that's what leads me to JVs even. I think there's never been a better time than now to partner up with this empty nester to JV. Some of these guys, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the skills or the courage or the confidence to develop their own backyard. Maybe you're listening and you are that empty nester. Maybe you do have that big backyard and you've thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and this might be your springboard to go and do that development. But a lot of this demographic, they might have worked hard their whole life. They've worked hard, they've paid off that property, they've got a fair bit of super, they might even own an investment property, but they're looking at opportunities of what they can do next. Some people don't have the courage to develop that space, and that's where you, as a savvy investor, developer, builder, developer, can come into play. This is where you can develop a really fine skill of being able to piece together and put together an incredible opportunity, a deal where the vendor does well, but also you do well. It might be a site where you could possibly keep the house. They might want to keep the house. And this is where the JV structure can work really well, where the vendor, they're just sick of mowing that backyard. They're sick of maintaining that huge pool that no one uses anymore. It's a big backyard. They love the area. They're not interested in moving, but they also see the opportunity to bring in some more cash, some more revenue, and maybe reinvest it, or they might even want to keep a townhouse. And I've seen that where there's opportunities to do 3, 4, sometimes even more villas or townhouses in a backyard, where the vendor might keep that front property. They keep that house, but it's now just got a small yard, maintainable. They get everything they've ever wanted. They've still got their house, but all of a sudden they've carved off that back property, and you might part of that JV arrangement, and obviously that's the art in piecing together a joint venture, is coming up with an arrangement that is obviously beneficial for both parties. They're obviously going to have their solicitor. They're going to have advisors who are going to obviously look at the deal. So it's not about making it one-sided. Both parties have to win to make this work, and there also has to be good synergy, because at the end of the day, when you're doing a joint venture with someone, you've got to have a high level of trust. There's got to be a high level of good communication. There's got to be some boundaries set too. The last thing you want is someone overstepping their boundaries, and if you're the developer and you're JVing with a vendor, you got to remember sometimes they can be very emotionally invested to that site, obviously to their property. So you've got to iron these things out from the very start, and I just find it's best to really set really clear boundaries, clear guidelines of how this project is going to be mapped out. I think as the developer, you need to take the front foot. You need to be able to control this development. You need to have milestones. You need to have clear communication of this is how it's going to look. And you've got to back that up, and you've got to follow that through. If you say you're going to do something, you've got to do it. If you say you're committing to paying rates, or you're paying these additional things along the way, you've got to follow that up. You've got to show them that. If they're getting no say in the design, well, you've got to be upfront with that from the very start, and you've got to get them to agree to that. If they do have a say, well, you've got to make sure you set some clear boundaries, because you've got to remember sometimes people can be very emotionally invested to that site, and the problem is when that happens, they might overcook the design. If you've given them free rein in terms of design input in the early stage of that product, they might completely overcapitalize it and overcook it because they're emotionally invested to that site. They might have lived there for 20, 30 years. So you got to remember there's some key things that can really break a development, and it can break a relationship, and it can cause unnecessary angst. And a lot of times it could have been rectified by setting really clear, concise boundaries from the start. But these JVs are really powerful because I believe in the next decade there is going to be a record number of these type of demographic. And you got to remember a lot of these houses, because see, our buying pool, we're going to have a record number of ultimate buyers in the next decade who are going to want to buy downsizer type properties. We went through a period of time all across, especially coastal, metro type areas where everyone wanted double-story houses, double-story townhouses, double-story duplexes. And look, there's still a massive place for that. But isn't it funny that there's a real emergence now of a more livable type product? And the reason why we're seeing that is simply because of the largest buying pool at the moment that we have is older people, empty nesters, downsizers, people looking to downsize from a property into another. So we're seeing a single-story product is super popular now, massively popular. And look, and because that buying pool is so large, but the supply is quite limited at the moment. So what happens when you've got this issue? People start to pay a higher price for a property that hits the mark. They start to pay a higher price for a property because there's a limited amount of it. And when they're fully cashed up, they've sold a property for 2, 3, 4 million, depending on where they live. They've got all this cash. And if there's a product for 900 or 950 or 1.2 and it's worth that, some of them will go to 1.25, 1.3. Some of them will go to a higher price because there's nothing like it around. It ticks all of their boxes. It might be completely flat, no steps, wider doors, wider hallways. It could just be little factors and things that come into play for the mindset of that particular buyer. But they're things that probably weren't popular over the last decade and now are making an emergence. And I think that's why it's important for residential investors and developers to always be cutting edge, always be thinking ahead of what's possible and of what can be done. I just think this is a little strategy, a little ploy that I think some developers can latch onto in this tricky climate that we are in, because I often find if you can get a product where you can keep a dwelling on the property, the numbers quite often stack up quite well. Sometimes yield isn't the greatest thing. Knocking a house down and getting one extra townhouse sometimes doesn't stack up. Often, I shouldn't say sometimes, it often doesn't stack up versus maybe keeping the house and just doing a couple of townhouses. And sometimes you'll find you can even sell that house back to the market for not much less than what you got the whole site for, and all of a sudden you've paid very minimal for the land for those couple of dwellings, whether it be 2 or 3 or 4 at the back, and that's where you can make your money. It's not through the build, but simply through the yield on the land and through the acquisition of the land by doing it that way. And I think it's important to look at your strategy. Sometimes more is not best because you've got to know who your buying pool is. You've got to know who your market is, who is looking at that area. Is it an area where is it close to services? Is it close to shops? Is it close to the CBD? Is it close to a bowling club or a golf club? Is it close to schools? Is it close to all those different types of services? And that very much then determines the type of product that you might put in that big backyard. It might be close to schools. It might be close to a train station. It could be a perfect environment and a place for young families who want to get into the market. And that's where you might be able to look at possibly 2-story townhouses could be beneficial. It could be perfect for that particular market for young families with young children who can't afford to buy a full-size house at this point, but a 2-story townhouse might be perfect. So then you can go down that route. It might be an area where townhouses aren't popular. They're not common. They're not popular. Sometimes you'll find just doing one other big house with a battle axe type scenario in a backyard could be the perfect scenario for a buyer. We've often found, especially in this last 12 or 18 months, we've seen sites where you could have done 3, but often it's worked out better just to keep a house and do one really good size house, single story, on that property. Single story enables you to obviously get the build costs down. You don't need scaffolding. The price and the build cost can come down because you're working on that ground level. But also you can often increase your buying pool because a single story house can attract a larger buying pool. You can attract elderly people, empty nesters, people who maybe don't want steps for that purpose. You can often attract young families or even families in general because they don't want to be going up and down steps. They might have young children who they don't want falling down steps. It increases your buying pool, and it's often a product that is a lot easier to sell than a townhouse. So there's so many different factors and scenarios to look into, and that's where it's really vital to know your buyer, to know your area, to know what's around, to know who the buyers are in that area, what they're looking for, and to really take a look at the surroundings of what is in the vicinity of this property and who will it attract, what type of buyer will it attract, and just going from there. So, for me, that's just a great little strategy. If you jumped on just Google Maps, for example, if you jumped on any type of software, 6 Maps or anything where you can get a look at overlays of properties, you could just pick one suburb and just circle every property that has a big backyard. You'll be amazed of what is out there. I've had clients. I've seen people pick up sites by just even knocking on a door and doing JVs. I've seen really incredible JVs done where just simply knocking on a door, where you see an opportunity where maybe someone's house needs a bit of TLC, or you literally just know their needs. If you go and buy RP data, for example, you can literally go and see when that house was sold. If you know it was sold in 1990 or 1980 or 85 or quite a while ago, there's a good chance that the vendors are starting to, they might be baby boomers, or they're starting to hit that age of possibly either retiring or thinking about retirement. And straight away, some of their pain points could be these very things about the big backyards, about, it's starting to get overwhelming. It was terrific when the kids were there, when there was heaps of space, but it's no longer of any use. And at that point in their life, they're also starting to think about what can they leave their kids in regards to inheritance. They're starting to think about doing a bit of travel. They're starting to think about investment. They're all of a sudden they've either stopped working, they're about to stop working, so they're starting to think about that regular income that is about to drop or it has dropped, and they're looking at opportunities of what can we do. And all of a sudden, they may not have seen the possibility in you just coming to the table and presenting this opportunity as a JV. You'll be amazed. You might get 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 no's, but you only need the one yes. And a lot of people aren't hungry enough to get out there and to go and get that one yes. And in a tricky market, it's the people who persevere, the people who have a bit of hunger and a bit of drive to do something different to what the rest of the market is doing, I find the ones that will often do well. A lot of sites at the moment on the market just aren't stacking up because people are wanting overs. Agents are pumping up the tires of the vendors, and it just does not stack up. It just does not make sense. You get the odd builder that might take it because they're just trying to get builder's margin. They're short on jobs and maybe take a little bit of a smaller development margin. Sometimes you'll see that happen, but so many sites are not stacking up. So it's the people that have a bit of drive to get out there and do things a little bit differently, whether it be engage a buyer's agent, get a property consultant on your behalf, or to literally go and knock on some doors yourself or send out letters or approach people and see if they'd be open to JVs and strategically target these type of properties. You'll be amazed. It's a case of attrition. It's just a case of numbers. You will know you send out a certain amount of letters, make a certain amount of calls, knock knock on a certain amount of doors, you're bound to find someone who is open to that possibility. You go through that process of narrowing down that focus. It's just one strategy I think will be really powerful over the next 10 years. So look, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's a very unique strategy. If it's something that you are interested in doing, I'm more than happy to have a short 20-minute feasibility session with you and just break it down and give you some tools for that toolkit. But look, have a think about little strategies like this as you launch into the next couple of years. Always be thinking about what is the next thing. What is something that's going to be prevalent and powerful and possible in this current climate? And then you can just begin to come up with a plan of attack of how you can execute it and generate lifetime wealth for yourself and for your family, and really go about living a life that you want to live. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next week.